The Thing That Lurks in Room 13. Chapter 1. The First Night in Room 13. I'll never forget the way the air felt that first night. Heavy, charged, as if the room itself were holding its breath. The bedspread was crisp, too perfect, the furniture oddly angled, and the single bulb in the overhead fixture cast shadows that shouldn't have been there. When I closed the door behind me, the silence was absolute. The kind of silence that presses on your ears until you start to hear things that aren't there. A distant shuffle, a faint whisper. I told myself it was nothing, just an old room in an even older hotel. The receptionist hadn't acted odd when I checked in, though she did pause briefly when I said I'd take room 13. Maybe it was a moment of surprise, or maybe just my imagination. The first hour passed uneventfully. I unpacked my bag, hung a shirt in the closet, placed my phone on the nightstand. I even turned on the television for background noise, but the static was unbearable, so I turned it off again. That's when I started noticing things. The closet door wasn't quite closed anymore. I distinctly remembered shutting it, but now it hung open just an inch. The shadows seemed deeper than they should have been, stretching further into the room. The heavy burgundy drapes shifted slightly, though the windows were sealed and the air conditioning was off. And then came the noise. It wasn't a knock, not exactly. It was a tap, soft but deliberate, like a finger gently striking the wall. I froze. It came again, this time on the far side of the room, then again from somewhere near the bed. I turned, my breath shallow, but saw nothing. I walked to the window, checked behind the drapes. Nothing. I reached for the closet door and pulled it open. Nothing, just the empty space where I'd hung my shirt. But as I stood there, I felt it, that heavy, breathless stillness growing thicker, pressing closer. I shut the closet door, sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. The tapping had stopped, but the feeling hadn't. It never really left. I spent the rest of the night sitting there, waiting for something I couldn't name, and when morning came, I was grateful for the light. Chapter 2. A shadow at the door. It wasn't until the second night that I saw it. The day had passed without incident. An ordinary breakfast, a walk through town, even a brief nap in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the lobby windows. I almost managed to convince myself that the strange occurrences the night before were the product of my overactive imagination. By the time I returned to room 13, I was ready to fall asleep without worry. I double-checked the closet, made sure it was firmly shut, and pulled the heavy drapes closed so no light from the parking lot outside could filter in. I even left the bedside lamp on, its warm glow reassuring me that nothing could hide in the dark. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Hours passed and the room grew quieter as the other hotel guests settled in for the night. The occasional footsteps in the hall faded until there was only stillness. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my body tense despite my efforts to relax. That's when I heard it, the soft creak of the floorboards just outside my door. At first I told myself it was someone passing by. But the sound didn't continue down the hall. It stopped just outside. My heart began to race as I imagined a shadowy figure standing there, just beyond the thin barrier of the door. I wanted to get up and check, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, my breathing shallow as though any sound I made might draw it closer. And then I saw it. A dark shape, faint but undeniable, stretched across the sliver of light beneath the door. It stood still, unmoving, and I realized it wasn't the shadow of a person. It was too indistinct, too amorphous. It shifted slightly, almost like smoke curling in place. I wanted to convince myself it was a trick of the light, but the shape didn't fade. It lingered there for what felt like an eternity before slowly retreating. The floorboards creaked again, softer this time, as though it was moving away. But I didn't hear any footsteps, just that faint, almost imperceptible shuffle. I stayed in bed, staring at the door until the first light of morning seeped through the edges of the drapes. Whatever had been there was gone, but I knew it would come back. It wasn't finished with me yet. Chapter 3: Strange Whispers in the Dark. By the time the third night arrived, the room's silence no longer felt comforting. The stillness seemed purposeful now, as if it were hiding something. I left the bedside lamp on again and tucked myself under the covers, hoping that sleep would come quickly and put an end to my growing unease. But the whispers started before I could even close my eyes. They weren't loud. In fact, they were so faint I might not have noticed them if I weren't already on edge. At first, they seemed to drift in from outside, like the murmur of a conversation just beyond the walls. But as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that they weren't coming from the hall or the parking lot. They were inside the room. I sat up slowly, listening intently. The whispers didn't stop. They shifted, moving from one corner of the room to another, never forming clear words. I couldn't tell if it was one voice or many, but there was a strange rhythm to it, pauses and murmurs that almost felt like a song. I swung my legs off the bed and reached for the flashlight I had brought. The beam cut through the dim light from the bedside lamp, sweeping across the room. The closet door was shut just as I had left it. The drapes hung still and heavy. Nothing appeared out of place. But the whispers didn't fade. If anything, they grew more insistent. When I stood up, the air around me felt colder, heavier. I walked slowly toward the closet, my hand gripping the flashlight like a weapon. I paused in front of the door, the whispers seeming to gather just behind it. Summoning all my courage, I pulled the door open. The closet was empty, just my shirt hanging neatly and my shoes on the floor, but the whispers didn't stop. They were all around me now, encircling me like a cold wind. I backed away, my pulse racing, and tried to steady my breathing. I pointed the flashlight toward the window, half expecting to see something there, but the glass reflected only my own frightened face. I returned to bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin. The whispers faded slightly, becoming faint murmurs once again. I lay awake for hours, afraid to close my eyes, waiting for the voices to return. Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep, but even in my dreams, I could hear them. Those strange, disembodied whispers that refused to leave me alone. Chapter 4: The Uneven Footsteps. I'd been dreading the moment when night would fall again. The previous nights had left me on edge, but I hoped, maybe foolishly, that the strange occurrences would simply stop. Yet, as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows took over room 13, I knew that wasn't going to happen. The night started like the others with an oppressive stillness. I sat on the bed, fully clothed, my flashlight clutched tightly in one hand. The bedside lamp cast a dim glow, but it didn't feel strong enough. Every corner of the room seemed darker, every sound amplified. At first, it was just a faint creak, the kind you'd expect from old floorboards. But then it happened again, one after another. Uneven footsteps, heavy and deliberate. I froze, my pulse quickening. They weren't coming from the hallway or the room above. They were right outside my door. I leaned forward, my muscles tense. The footsteps stopped, then started again, moving closer to the door. Each step was measured as if whoever or whatever was out there wanted me to know they were coming. My hand hovered over the flashlight's switch. I wanted to be ready for anything, but I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready for what was waiting beyond the door. I strained my ears, listening for any other noise, but all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. When the footsteps stopped right outside the door, the silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. It was the silence of someone, or something, standing still, waiting. I mustered the courage to speak. My voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper. "Hello?" No response, just the stillness. I tried again, louder this time. "Who's there?" Again, no answer. But then, a soft shuffle, as if the person or thing shifted its weight. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I stood up slowly, every muscle in my body screaming at me to stay put. But my curiosity and fear propelled me forward. I reached the door and pressed my ear against it, but heard nothing. With trembling hands, I reached for the doorknob. Before I could turn it, the footsteps started again, retreating this time. The sound grew fainter and fainter until it vanished completely. I opened the door quickly and shined my flashlight into the hallway. It was empty. The old carpet stretched out in both directions, illuminated only by faint moonlight spilling through a distant window. I stepped into the hall, my flashlight sweeping from side to side. Nothing, no one. The footsteps were gone. I returned to the room and locked the door behind me, my chest tight with unanswered questions. For the rest of the night, I didn't hear them again, but I knew they'd be back. They always came back. Chapter 5. The Flickering Light. The night started with a low hum, barely noticeable at first. I had returned to room 13 after a long day of trying to distract myself. A walk through the nearby shops, a meal at a bustling diner, anything to avoid thinking about what awaited me. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the room's shadows deepened, I felt that same heaviness settle in. I turned on every light in the room, hoping to chase away the unease. The bedside lamp, the overhead fixture, even the small bulb in the closet. For a while it worked. The room seemed ordinary again, just another forgettable hotel room. But then the flickering began. It started with the bedside lamp. A quick, faint dimming, so brief that I thought it might have been my imagination. But then it happened again, more pronounced this time. The light wavered, dimming and brightening, almost as if it were responding to something unseen. My heart rate quickened. I reached out and tapped the lamp as if that might stop it. For a moment it seemed to work. The light stabilized and I let out a shaky breath. Then the overhead light joined in. The bulb buzzed faintly, its glow fluctuating. The room took on an eerie rhythm, lights dimming and brightening in a slow, unsettling pattern. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the flashlight I had brought, unsure of what to do. It wasn't just the lights themselves, it was the feeling that came with them, as if the room were alive, shifting in time with the flickers. The air grew colder, and the hum I'd heard earlier became more pronounced. I shined my flashlight around the room, looking for any source of the disturbance. The closet door remained firmly shut, the curtains motionless. Yet, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was not alone. As the flickering intensified, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was almost in sync with the lights, as if the tapping and the flickering were two parts of the same phenomenon. My breathing grew shallow, and I edged closer to the door, ready to flee if something appeared. But nothing did. The lights continued their unsettling dance. The tapping persisted, and the room felt more oppressive by the second. I didn't dare turn off the lights or open the closet. I stayed seated on the bed, the flashlight clutched tightly in my hand, until the first rays of dawn filtered through the curtains. When the sun fully rose, the light stopped flickering. The tapping ceased. The room seemed ordinary once more. I stood, my legs trembling, and turned off the lamps one by one. But I knew that tonight would be no different. The flickering light would return, and so would the unseen presence it heralded. Chapter 6: The Locked Closet. The closet in room 13 had become a strange focal point of my nights. Every evening I double-checked that it was shut, and every evening I still felt its presence looming in the dark. The unease it brought wasn't just in my imagination anymore. I could swear that the closet had shifted closer, that its heavy wooden door was somehow alive, breathing with the room itself. I sat on the edge of the bedside lamp casting long shadows. I hadn't dared open it since that first night. The memory of that heavy, breathless stillness still lingered. But as the hours stretched on, the thought of leaving it closed began to gnaw at me. If something truly was inside, I reasoned, wasn't it better to face it and be done with it? The room grew colder. The faint hum that had become so familiar seemed louder tonight, almost like a whisper under the breath. My eyes kept drifting toward the closet door. It sat there, immobile, but it felt expectant, like it was waiting for me to make the first move. Finally, I couldn't stand it any longer. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and took a deep breath. With shaking hands, I stepped toward the closet. The air around it was cooler, the wood seeming to radiate a chill. My hand hovered over the handle, hesitant. The whispers grew louder, though still unintelligible, as though they were seeping through the cracks in the door. Summoning all the courage I could muster, I turned the handle. The door creaked open, the flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. Just my neatly hung shirt, the pair of shoes I'd left there on the first day, and the blank, empty walls. Relief washed over me, and I let out a shaky laugh. But the moment I closed the door, the whispering stopped. The room went silent. Not just quiet, but a suffocating, unnatural stillness. The air felt thick, heavy. I returned to the bed, my pulse still racing, and sat down. The flashlight in my hand flickered briefly, and I froze. I could feel it again. That weight in the room, that breathless presence. I looked at the closet door. It hadn't moved, but I could sense it. Whatever it wasn't inside the closet. It never had been. It had always been just outside, watching, waiting. As I sat in room 13, Chapter 7, A Note Beneath the Bed. By the time I returned to the room that evening, my nerves were frayed. The tapping, the flickering, the oppressive presence, all of it had been building, but I still held on to some shred of hope that tonight would be different. That maybe, somehow, I'd find some normalcy again. I double-checked the closet door, made sure the lights were stable, and settled into bed. At first, the room was quiet, the same stillness I'd come to expect, heavy and watchful. But it wasn't long before the feeling crept back, that strange weight in the air. The sensation of being observed. I shifted under the covers, trying to ignore it, and then I felt something beneath the mattress. It was small, hard, and definitely out of place. My pulse quickened as I reached down, hesitant to touch whatever it was. My fingers brushed paper. I pulled it out, a folded note, yellowed and brittle with age. My hands trembled as I opened it. The writing was faint but still legible. 4 words written in hurried, uneven script. It knows you're here. My breath caught. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, the shadows deeper. I stared at the note, trying to make sense of it. Who had left it? How long had it been there? And what did it mean? A sudden noise broke my thoughts, a faint scuffling sound from under the bed. I froze. The note slipped from my fingers, drifting to the floor. The noise came again, closer this time. I grabbed the flashlight, flicked it on, and leaned over the edge of the bed. The beam of light revealed nothing but the carpet and the frame, but the sound didn't stop. It moved, faint and deliberate, as if something was crawling just out of view. My heart pounded, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I reached down, my hand shaking, and swept the flashlight back and forth. Still nothing. I pulled myself back onto the bed, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I sat there, my body rigid, waiting for it to return. But it didn't. Instead, the silence returned, heavier than before. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in bed, the note lying on the floor beside me, my mind racing, the words replayed in my head over and over. It knows you're here. Chapter 8. Midnight Visitors. The night felt heavier than usual, as though the air in room 13 had turned into a dense fog. I left the bedside lamp on again, its pale yellow glow barely pushing back against the darkness that seemed to seep into every corner. I tried to focus on anything else. My phone screen, a book I'd brought along, but my attention kept drifting to the shadows around me. By midnight, I was restless, unable to shake the sensation that something was different. That's when I heard it. A faint knock. Not on the door, but on the wall. It was soft, hesitant, almost polite. I froze, listening. Another knock followed, louder this time, then silence. My heart raced as I slowly stood and approached the wall. The knocking seemed to come from the far side of the room, near the corner where the closet stood. I pressed my ear to the wall but heard nothing more. I told myself it could be the pipes or the old wood settling. But then a new sound reached my ears, a quiet shuffling noise, like someone pacing back and forth on the carpet. I turned around, clutching the flashlight tightly. The air seemed colder and my breath came in short, quick gasps. I aimed the flashlight beam toward the closet, half expecting to see the door ajar. But it was still closed as I had left it. I swept the light across the room, my heart pounding, but saw nothing. The pacing stopped, and the silence that followed was even more unnerving. I returned to the bed, sitting stiffly on the edge, my flashlight resting on my lap. My eyes stayed fixed on the closet, waiting for the slightest movement. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I began to doubt myself, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. And then it happened again. A faint knock, this time on the door. I jumped, the flashlight nearly slipping from my hands. The knock wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. The kind of knock you'd expect from someone standing outside, waiting to be let in. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just sat there, holding my breath. After a long moment, I forced myself to stand. My legs felt heavy, as though the very air around me was pulling me down. I moved toward the door, every step an effort. When I reached it, I paused, my hand hovering over the knob. Another knock sounded, softer than before but insistent. I gripped the knob, my fingers trembling, and slowly turned it. The door creaked open, revealing the empty hallway beyond. It was eerily quiet, the dim light from the hallway casting long shadows. No one was there. I stepped into the hall, looking both ways. Nothing. No sound, no movement. I shut the door, locking it again, and leaned against it. The knocking didn't return that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had let something in, or that it had never left. Chapter 9. The Disappearing Guest. I didn't expect to see anyone in the hallway. It was well past midnight and the hotel had long since quieted down. But as I left room 13 to clear my head, I caught a glimpse of someone standing at the far end of the hall. A man, his silhouette faintly outlined by the dim light spilling from a window. His head was slightly tilted, as though he were listening for something. I hesitated, debating whether to call out to him. Something about his stillness was unnerving. The air felt heavier as I took a cautious step forward. The floor creaked softly beneath my feet, and the man turned his head toward me. Even in the faint light, I could see his expression, or rather the lack of one. His face was blank, featureless, like a shadow in the shape of a man. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Before I could move or speak, he stepped backward into the shadows and disappeared. Not into a room or around a corner, he simply faded, as if the darkness had swallowed him whole. Heart pounding, I hurried back to my room, locking the door behind me. I pressed my back against it, trying to steady my breathing. The hall had been empty, I knew it had, but that man, if he was even a man, had been there. I'd seen him, and now he was gone. I spent the rest of the night staring at the door, waiting for the sound of footsteps or a knock that never came. The silence was almost worse than noise, filled with the tension of something unseen and unanswered. By dawn, My nerves were shot. I knew one thing for certain. Room 13 wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a place where things disappeared, leaving only questions and fear in their wake. Chapter 10. Secrets in the Walls. I never thought I'd find myself pulling at wallpaper in the dead of night, but the house had a way of drawing you toward its secrets. It started with a subtle peeling, a corner of the paper curling away from the wall near the baseboard. The pattern was old-fashioned, ornate floral designs that seemed out of place, even for a house this old. I'd noticed it earlier in the day, a small detail that I thought little of. But as the night stretched on and the familiar feeling of being watched grew stronger, my eyes kept drifting to that spot. I told myself it was just idle curiosity, a distraction, but as I sat there, the sense that something was just behind that wall became impossible to ignore. At first, I only touched the edge of the loose wallpaper, running my fingers along it. The paper was brittle, decades-old glue cracking under the lightest pressure. I tugged gently, expecting a hollow sound or perhaps nothing at all. But instead, the wall felt solid, sturdy. I paused, half relieved, and yet I couldn't shake the notion that there was something more. The tapping started again, soft, irregular, but unmistakable. It was as if the house itself was giving permission, encouraging me to continue. I pulled the paper further. The pattern tore, revealing bare plaster beneath. It was cracked, the fissures running in jagged lines that seemed almost deliberate. And then I felt it, air, faint but cool, seeping through one of the cracks. I leaned in, shining my flashlight on the exposed plaster. What I saw didn't make sense. The cracks weren't random. They formed a pattern, a symbol that I couldn't quite understand. But it felt intentional, ancient. As I traced it with my fingers, the air grew colder, and the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer coming from behind the wall. It was all around me. My heart raced and I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The room fell into shadow, but the sound continued, rhythmic and unyielding. For a moment I thought I saw movement in the corner of my vision, something shifting within the darkness. I fumbled for the flashlight and shone it toward the wall again. The symbol was gone, replaced by smooth plaster. The tapping stopped. The room was still. I backed away from the wall, the torn wallpaper hanging in loose strips. The air felt heavy, charged with a presence I couldn't see but could feel in my bones. I didn't dare touch the wall again that night, but I knew I'd find myself drawn back. The house had secrets, and it wasn't done revealing them. Chapter 11. The Thing That Knocks. By the 11th night, I was used to the noises. They came regularly now. Knocking, shuffling, even the faint whispers I had tried so hard to ignore. But that night was different. That night, the knocks weren't faint taps or polite raps. They were loud, deliberate, and far too close. It began just after midnight. I was lying on the bed, staring at the cracked ceiling when the first knock sounded. It was sharp, commanding, and it didn't come from the door. I sat up, gripping the flashlight on the nightstand. Another knock came, then another, as if someone or something was demanding entry. I swung my legs off the bed and turned on the flashlight. The beam swept across the room, illuminating the closet door, the drapes, the old wallpaper. Nothing moved. I stood, slowly making my way toward the sound. The knocks grew louder, each one shaking the floor beneath me. My heart raced, my throat dry. I reached the door and pressed my ear against it, bracing for a response. But the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, an oppressive stillness that made the room feel smaller, darker. I stayed there, ear to the door, waiting for any sign of movement. When none came, I backed away and returned to the bed, gripping the flashlight tightly. Hours passed. The knocking didn't return, but the air in the room felt heavier, thicker. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the door, waiting for the next sound. When dawn finally broke, the light streaming through the window brought little comfort. The room still felt haunted, as though the presence that had been knocking was still there, watching, waiting for the next chance to make itself known. Chapter 12. A Key Found at Dawn. The hours before dawn were the longest I'd ever endured. I sat motionless on the bed, flashlight in hand, my eyes fixed on the door as though it might burst open at any moment. The knocking hadn't returned, but the weight of its presence still hung heavy in the air. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind outside felt magnified, like the room itself was breathing around me. As the faint glow of early morning seeped through the heavy curtains, something changed. The air seemed to lift, as though the unseen force had retreated. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Then I noticed it. On the nightstand, where I'd left only my flashlight and phone, there was now a small, antique key. I stared at it, my heart racing. It hadn't been there before, I was certain of it. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The metal was cool to the touch, its surface smooth and polished, save for a faint engraving of what looked like a series of intersecting circles. The key felt unnaturally heavy in my palm. I turned it over, trying to make sense of where it had come from or what it was for. It was too large to fit any of the locks I'd seen in the room, and there hadn't been any mention of extra keys when I checked in. My mind raced through possibilities. Had someone entered while I dozed off? Had it simply materialized on its own? The latter seemed impossible. Yet so did everything else I'd experienced since coming to room 13. I rose from the bed, holding the key tightly. My first thought was to try the closet, but it didn't have a keyhole, just the same simple handle. The door to the hallway had its own standard lock, and the windows were sealed shut. I looked around the room, my flashlight sweeping over every surface. Nothing else had changed, yet this key felt like a message, a new piece of the puzzle I was trapped in. As I stood there, dawn fully broke and the pale sunlight began to spill into the room. The oppressive atmosphere that had weighed on me all night seemed to dissipate, leaving me drained but determined. Whatever this key belonged to, it had to mean something. It had to lead somewhere. And I knew I wouldn't find any answers until I discovered what it unlocked. For the first time in days, I felt a spark of clarity. This wasn't just about fear anymore, it was about understanding. I placed the key carefully in my pocket, resolved to figure out what it was and why it had appeared. Room 13 had given me a new clue, and I wasn't going to let it go to waste. Chapter 13. The Room That Wouldn't Let Go. The morning light gave me courage, but it was fleeting. As soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the oppressive weight returned. The air grew colder, the shadows stretched longer, and every creak of the floor seemed magnified. I sat on the edge of the bed, the key still in my pocket, unsure if I dared to find what it unlocked. I had decided to leave. I'd already packed my bag and planned my escape, but when I reached for the doorknob, something stopped me. The key in my pocket grew unnaturally warm, almost burning against my leg. I yanked it out, clutching it in my hand. The metal cooled instantly, as if warning me not to go. I hesitated at the door, the weight of the key heavy in my palm. The room felt alive, as if it knew what I was about to do. It was more than the whispers, the tapping, or the strange noises. It was the feeling that the room itself had a will, and it wasn't ready to let me leave. I turned back toward the closet. That heavy wooden door stood as it always did, immobile, intimidating. The key's intricate pattern of intersecting circles seemed to align with the strange markings I'd seen behind the wallpaper. My mind raced, piecing together fragments of a puzzle I never wanted to solve. With trembling hands, I approached the closet, the key held tightly in my fist. The closer I got, the louder the whispers became. They weren't words, not exactly, but an insistent rhythm that seemed to echo in my mind. I reached for the closet door handle and froze. The key was no longer warm, it was ice cold. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the key in one hand, the closet door handle in the other. Finally, I turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing the same empty interior as before. The shirt I had hung up was gone, as were the shoes I'd left on the floor. Instead, the space was filled with a faint, pale light that seemed to come from nowhere. I stepped closer, the whispers growing louder. The light didn't hurt my eyes, but it felt unnatural, like the glow of something that shouldn't exist. I reached into the closet, half expecting to feel the smooth wall, but my hand passed through the light. It was cold, and for a moment I felt as though I'd stepped into another place entirely. But just as quickly as it came, the light flickered and disappeared. The closet was empty again. The whispers stopped. The air grew still. I backed away, clutching the key. The room seemed to sigh, as if it had momentarily released me from its grip. But I knew it wasn't over. I had found something. Something the room didn't want me to see, and it wasn't going to let me go so easily. Chapter 14. The Final Confrontation. The night before had left me drained, but I knew it wasn't over. There was a finality in the way the key felt in my hand, a weight that pressed against me, demanding I face what the room had to offer. I waited until darkness fell, until the house was quiet, and then I prepared myself. I placed the key in my pocket, grabbed the flashlight, and stood in front of the closet door once more. The pale light that had flickered before was gone, but the whispers had returned, faint but steady. They seemed to come from all around me, urging me to open the door, to step inside. My heart pounded as I reached for the knob, the cold metal biting into my skin. When I turned the key, the lock gave way with an audible click. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow passage that hadn't been there before. The air that rushed out was cold and damp, carrying with it a faint metallic tang. I shone the flashlight into the darkness. The walls were lined with old, crumbling brick, and the floor sloped downward, disappearing into a deeper shadow. I stepped inside, the door closing behind me with a hollow thud. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. I couldn't understand the words, but their tone was clear, angry, urgent, almost pleading. My footsteps echoed as I descended, the beam of light trembling in my hands. At the bottom of the slope, I found myself in a small chamber. The walls were covered in symbols similar to the ones I had seen in the cracks of the wallpaper. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it lay a single ancient object, a small blackened box. The whispers reached a fever pitch as I approached, the air vibrating with their intensity. I hesitated. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to turn back and never return. But something in the room pulled at me, a force I couldn't resist. I reached out, my fingers brushing the surface of the box. It was warm, almost alive. The whispers stopped. For a moment there was complete silence. Then the box began to hum, a deep, resonant sound that filled the chamber. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, casting eerie light. I opened the box and the room seemed to shudder. Inside was a small, smooth stone, its surface etched with lines that pulsed with a faint, otherworldly light. As I held it, a voice, clear and unmistakable, spoke. It was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It simply said, "You have found it." The light intensified and the room began to crumble. I stumbled back, clutching the stone. The passage behind me collapsed, leaving only the closet door. I ran, pushing it open and slamming it shut behind me. Back in the room, the air was still. The whispers were gone. I sat on the bed, the stone heavy in my hand. I didn't know what I had taken or why it had been hidden, but the room no longer felt oppressive. The presence was gone, leaving me with only questions and the weight of the object in my palm. I knew I couldn't stay in room 13 any longer. Whatever I had found, it had changed the house, and it had changed me. Chapter 15. Dawn breaks over room 13. The first light of dawn crept through the shattered window, illuminating the room in a soft golden hue. For the first time in weeks, the house felt quiet. Not the oppressive silence of before, but a stillness that hinted at peace. I sat on the floor, my back against the far wall, watching as the sunlight stretched across the floorboards, erasing the shadows one by one. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on my mind. The blinking eyes, the faces in the glass, the strange, suffocating darkness. I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened, but now, as the morning light filled the room, it felt as though the house had let out a long, shuddering breath. Whatever had lingered here, whatever had pressed itself against that window, seemed to have receded. I stood slowly, my legs stiff and unsteady. The floor was littered with shards of glass, their edges catching the sunlight and scattering faint rainbows across the walls. Carefully, I picked my way through the mess and approached the window frame. The glass was gone, leaving only the warped wood and a faint chill from the morning air. I leaned out slightly, looking down at the backyard. The grass was damp with dew, and the woods beyond were still, their tangled branches glowing softly in the dawn. I thought back to the first night in this house when the window had seemed nothing more than a quaint architectural feature. How long ago that felt now. In that time, I had come to fear the window, its presence, its strange reflections, its inexplicable movements. But as I stood there, the light warming my face, I felt something new, relief. The window no longer watched. The faces were gone. The air was clear and the whispers had faded. I didn't know what had changed or why the presence had finally lifted, but I didn't question it. I let myself believe for just a moment that it was truly over. I turned away from the window and began gathering the scattered glass, carefully placing the shards into a box. As I worked, the sunlight continued to grow stronger, brightening the room until it felt entirely different. It wasn't the same house anymore. It wasn't the same window. By the time the floor was clear, the morning had fully arrived. I stood once more at the window frame, looking out at the world. The shadows that had haunted me were gone, and though the memory of them remained, they felt distant, like the remnants of a fading dream. The window was still broken, but it no longer held power over me. I took a deep breath, the cool morning air filling my lungs, and I felt a small, cautious sense of hope. The dawn had come, and with it the promise of something new.